Hello. Why don't you listen to me?
Well, we haven't talked about
Oh, I was telling you, I was here for this class 2 years ago.
This is the one that you were
The
here?
one I was here for.
Oh,
I remember very little.
good. Sorry for the delay.
It worked in my favor, so it's perfectly fine.
Good. Molly's walking in, so we'll give her a little bit of a moment. So, just a lot happening.
I can imagine.
But I'm not going to be able to leave till later tonight.
At 7 or even later than 7?
Depends on when they get here, but hopefully 7.
Wait, you're driving?
Yes.
Oh, wow, I didn't realize that.
Road trip. Hi, Molly.
Molly?
Hello,
So are you
Molly.
driving like in the same car as Dakota, or how's that working?
Yeah, we're all together.
Mm-hmm.
We're going together in
How long of a drive is that?
2 hours.
That's not bad.
Over me.
2 drivers.
That is a sign that you are truly, despite growing up in North Carolina, you are truly a Midwesterner.
I traveled personally. Well, I traveled like a lot this summer.
Well, hello, Molly.
Hello.
All right. Basil, would you raise the lights, please?
Yeah.
Both. Yep.
Whoa.
You hold the top one up. That might brighten it up a little bit. Okay, we're good. All right. Shall we begin?
Yes.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Hail Mary.
Full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Blessed Jordan of Saxony.
Pray for us.
Saint Dominic.
Pray for us.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. All right. So, what's sort of left over from last week? Comments, questions, thoughts?
Look how they massacred my boy.
I think it was an interesting notion that a lot of the different sort of movements that cropped up did in some ways like come into the church and inform some of our dialogues and conflicts that we have even today, with people accusing each other of Jansenism and Pelagianism and all that. What's that?
Pelagianism.
Pelagianism. Sorry.
He's using the neoclassical.
There you go. Fair enough. Because it would be Pelagios, wouldn't it?
I think this is a really important point. So it was interesting. I was having a conversation with someone this morning about this. So we need to consider, or at least hold intention or be observant of sort of these broad movements and how do they manifest themselves in different sectors, right? Because what you have in these movements are the evolution of human society. Remember what I say, or I've said in the past, you cannot have religion outside of a people. Religion will always be incarnated and therefore expressed through a people in a particular economic situation, environment, geography, history, language. All of these inform, how the faith gets expressed or other things get expressed. And there are other factors at play, like I said, economics or climate, etc., that will help sort of shift or focus certain things on or emphasize particular aspects, will highlight or give fuel to a particular underlying ways of thinking, underlying ways of viewing the world, et cetera, et cetera. And so through all of these different lenses, you can find often the same base, right? So we have all of these different movements, right? There is a broader social shift happening. As economics are changing, the relationship between politics and the people is changing, or that our civil institutions and the people are changing. It shouldn't necessarily be a surprise that we see the same kinds of movements occurring in the church, but filtered through that framework, the vocabulary, the philosophical lenses or the theological lenses or practices, etc. We see that a lot today, right? You can map the political division in our country today on top of the church division in the church today. They map on top of each other. So what's the common denominator, right? This isn't a church-only thing. This isn't a, from on high decree thing down. This is a people living with and among each other and responding with one another. And so all of the different influences the church is going to be a part of that. The church is going to express itself in there. It's going to be influenced by it. And so how do we make the distinctions between what is of the church and what is of the culture? Sometimes it's very difficult to make the distinction. That's not an irrelevant question or necessarily a bad question, that there might not be a distinction. It's just a matter of understanding and being sensitive and observing the dynamic at play. Right? Does that make sense? Am I making some clear notes? Because I think to truly, I think, understand this class and the next class, and what class 5 was about, this Enlightenment and Modernity, what I was hoping to really try to emphasize is these tensions that all through society is happening. And there's so many, they're complicated layers upon layers. Reason, faith, economics, politics, what is a person, who, et cetera, where does authority lie? All of those sorts of things are all at play. And everybody's swimming in it. And it's hard sometimes to be able to parse out what's of what's of the other, because they're so intertwined. But to have the sensitivity about, on the eve of the French Revolution, what was society like? What were the things that were important? What were the dialogues that were happening, the social conversations, right? So if you were looking at the 60s, for example, you're looking at Vatican II, which will look at what were the social conversations? How did the church respond? And what were the dynamics, right? But it wasn't just a matter of faith, right? In the 60s, it was a whole social shifting that affected economics, equality, civil organization, et cetera, et cetera. And the church, in the midst of those movements, was one lens through which all of this social shifting was being adjudicated. Same thing's happening here. So what were those conversations happening, et cetera, et cetera? Those are the things to be sensitive to. What are the thoughts, comments from last week? Let me ask a question. It's really this class and next class that is probably going to seem the most familiar. The church is going to seem the most familiar to us. And it is really the church in which we live, or that is the most closest root from the French Revolution on. And that most defines or is the most direct cause or recent direct cause of why we look the way we do today, or practice the way we practice today, or think the way we think today with regards to church and who's a Christian and who has the authority to say so. It's mostly all the reaction of post-French Revolution. And so up to this point, we've now gone through 1700 years of church history, what are maybe some of the takeaways that you're having up to this point about how we got to this point? Remember, my whole thesis is trying to trace that thread to try to understand where we are today. Are you finding, your comments, is there validity to this? Do you disagree? Are there other things? I don't know, like the story that we've been telling so far, how is this hitting you?
One thing that I'm thinking about is with us, on the verge of talking about the French Revolution, is this reality that prior to the French Revolution in the history of the church, it seems like there's been this perpetual question of how exactly do the state and the church fit together or don't fit together, and there's really never been any sort of like settled answer of like, oh yeah, this arrangement seems to work. Like it's always just been kind of a tension, and then we're going to see it break, obviously, in a pretty violent way. But I think it's still a question today. Like, I don't know, how do we settle this? Is there one best solution? So.
And I think there's to that question, there's a practical, it could be a practical question, or it could be a theoretical question, right? So practically, is it good? That actually may change over time, right? And I think those are and the practicality of that is determined again on the people, the circumstances. In certain times it may not work so well, other times, or may not be good or the best. What are our expectations? Are we trying to create the new Jerusalem on earth where everybody's living in harmony with one another? Is it reasonable to expect church and state, in principle, to have a relationship between those two? Is that a good thing? Because the argument now is there shouldn't be a relationship. The question is, should there? What does that look like? What does that look like is a practical question and can have 1,000 different forms. We've seen a variety of them, right? But that's, I think, the ultimate question is the should. And if we should, how flexible are we to understand what those structures in that relationship looks like practically? Will it always work? Probably not. Will it ever be perfect? Probably not. Until the second coming and heaven and earth are joined. And that's really what heaven is described as in the second coming of Christ is about, right? But just because it can't be perfect or will be broken in many respects along the way, does it mean that we shouldn't have it? It's a different question.
I have a couple things to say, and it may not. Anyway, thy kingdom come. And so, to me, whenever you see movements where people are willing to sacrifice themselves for that to come nearer, is so good. And in what we've covered so far, for me as a layperson, what I've seen, because I've had a little difficulty, I fight with myself about the hierarchy in the church. And I go back, I just go back to Jesus and what did he do with the apostles? And isn't that what we're called to do, to care for all peoples? And so in one way, to try and see what divides us so that we can be more unified. And that's what I'm getting from this, is the church has seen what divides us and has worked towards rectifying that and finding what is the truth and what is kind of superfluous.
Let me maybe add to that, or what is the truth and how we would say we've maintained the truth and have been a voice of that at different times and in different places and in different situations, right? We've maintained that and have spoken that into society. You talk about it's the mission of Christ is to care for all peoples, right? How do we do that? To care for people is literally the role of a government. It is a political, social caring, right? And and at all different levels of human society. So should the church not have an institutional level and it's just all of this ad hoc one-on-one, right? Or, in the beginning in the apostles, they had an institutional level. Remember, the people would come and they would have these communities and they would give all their money to the apostles for the good of everybody. And the apostles would then distribute each according to their need. How is that not taxes or government, right? Or an institution versus then the deacons who are there going, that when we hear about this in Acts of the Apostles, caring for the sick, catechizing the individual, etc. You had both at the same time, right? But this idea of the mission of the church, preaching the gospel, going out, what is the look of governance? What's the role of governance when you're talking about a society of people in relationship with one another, right? That is politics at its purest form, right? It's a bit of a challenge. Question is, when do we do it well or not? There's a really great document in Vatican II that speaks of this, Dignitatis Humani, on the relationship of the church and state. And it speaks pretty clearly about the voice of the church in civil society as promoting the truth, preaching the truth. That voice is an important point because we do believe, we hold fundamental beliefs on the dignity of human persons, et cetera, et cetera. And so, yeah, and you need maybe comparable structures to be able to engage at the different levels. Not everybody's a Catherine of Siena, a little old hermit woman from a city to go to France and tell the Pope to do something, right? Sometimes that's a very rare person, for you, Molly, to go and, have that kind of influence to tell the Pope to, or whatever. Sometimes or to tell a civil leader to do this, that, and the other thing with what kind of authority. Sometimes you need to have those structures of parity between, right? So is this an issue of the church? Is this the issue of society, et cetera? It's an important question. See what I'm saying? And so we can talk about this in the grand sort of meta 1,000-foot view, but then there are the realities of living today, right? And the people's critiques of particular hierarchy or the way it works, or what particular local temporal decisions that were made, we may disagree with, or we may struggle with, or we might not like that person, or we might like that person better. And okay, that's that in the ground, and it's where the rubber meets the road. But that challenge is always between, okay, because it might not be perfect here at this particular moment in time, does that mean the whole structure is bad? Does that make sense? And are we aware of that tension between the here and now versus what we're trying to do? And what we have in this Enlightenment and modernity point is we no longer want the structures. We want to tear them down. And these long-standing institutions, whether it be the church, whether it be faith and theology as sort of the first go to tell us about the nature of humanity or the nature of the world, right? where you have this, no, I'm going to be the one, we are capable of our own, we create philosophies and sciences and exploration of things that are outside of the purview of the church. And that's more important, that's more relevant. We can be self-determining, we have our own agency, and you begin to get the philosophies of, social contracts and, you have the John Locke's and the Rousseau's, and you have blatant critiques of, kinds of reasoning, and that then get manifest at anger at structures, monarchies, churches, et cetera, right? And all of that's being played out. And humanity, societies are exploring these things. And the French Revolution becomes the great height of no, we want to throw away everything on principle, because on principle these things are bad. And we need to start again. We need to throw away those structures because they're corrupted. We saw a first manifestation of that in the Protestant Reformation, right? This goes even further. It isn't just a matter of theological faith. This goes deeper about the nature of the self and the human autonomy, individual autonomy, and self-determination. So remember those sort of two extremes that we're having then. We saw this. This is what I ended with last time. We have this sort of deism, atheism, scientism, right? That is a very self-determined way of engaging the world, and a more direct rejection of anything that might reek of superstition, faith, esotericism, etc. And you have that versus a hard rigidity of holding to those older principles. So we have Jansenism, Ultramontanism, loyalty to the church. It's been, this will withstand this rejection of all these things, and there's this rigid entrenchment. You have the Enlightenment, that in scientism it's very anti-passion, emotion, because it's very focused on reason. It can seem cool and cold. It's very methodical. Things of the heart are less important, versus the Romanticism, which is a reaction to that sort of cold scientism, and more Enlightenment thinking, where, I suffer from the vapors and the poetry and the flora, and this is where we get this whole sort of naturalism coming out, and it's very dramatic, it's very emotive, right? These are opposite extremes. And then again, we have monarchies, institutions, so those long-standing things versus individualism and self-determination, people. So institution versus people. And there are these dichotomies that are seeing each other as dangerous, or they're reacting against one another. So I'm going to move into, if there's no other comments on that, then straight into the French Revolution. So this is where we are in the late 1700s, right? Remember, in 1887, we have Voltaire's famous "écraser l'enfant," obliterate the dreaded thing, which is he's talking about the church. And it's sort of this height in France of this great critique. They're very explosive, emotive, vitriolic. I mean, if you read Candide, and some of the things, the satire, it's cutting and could be very lewd at times, and it's funny. But you have a sense of, this sort of public disdain. You watch, Les Mis, right? Les Miserables. Even that, we have that whole let them eat cake sort of mentality. That's the one-sided view of things, but it's meant to highlight the great disparity and the entrenched seeming inevitability of this powder keg waiting to blow. And the French Revolution was this tipping point. It was another influx or inflection point of the people versus the ancien régime, sort of the old regime. And remember the motto, liberté, fraternité, égalité, freedom, fraternity, equality, people. What about me? We have dignity, we have rights. It's this popular uprising against the institutions, right? And there's in 1789 the Declaration of the Rights of Men and Citizen, which is this declaration similar to our own Declaration of Independence, right? But proclaiming on the part of the people the sovereignty is in the people, not in the crown, and begins sort of this movement to overthrow the crown. We have the sovereignty. We're going to see revolutions like this again. We see this in Russia in 1917, right? Sovereignty is in the people, not the crown. The killing of the Romanovs. We'll see this. You see this in other places later into the 20th century. And it was a bloody mess. I mean, there was the very famous Reign of Terror by the Jacobins, the Jacobins. It was the Society of the Jacobins, or Friends of Freedom and Equality. And it was this organized group. We have figures like Robespierre, right? Famously, in Toulouse, there's the famous Jacobin church, which was a Dominican church, which the Jacobins took from us. And it's still called the Jacobin Church, and we never got it back after the French Revolution. Very famous church. But again, under Robespierre, this is the age of guillotines, riots, violence, public executions, exiles. Right? We see this again in sort of the Maoist revolution in China. Right? A lot of that. Public executions, public mockery, public riots, etc. The people taking the power against the things that are oppressive. So, and there was mass persecution of the church, the killing of clergy, the destruction of churches. Notre Dame, I think, was destroyed or let on fire at one point. It's had a couple renovations, but it was anyway. There was in 1790 the ruling the government put the civil constitution of the clergy, which basically declared in 1790 that the church is now under French rule. So similar to what King Henry VIII did, that sort of separated the French or the Anglican Church from Rome. They sort of were trying to do something. The church is now under French rule by the government, and there's no more Gallican church, meaning a church of the French. Gallican, sort of like if there was no more American church, the Church of the United States, right? And that's saying no, that just no longer exists. There's no more Gallican church. All religious orders were suppressed and outlawed. And so,
For how long?
We'll get to that. But they were all outlawed, and religious life in France went nearly extinct. Many clergy, if they were not killed, were in exile. For us Dominicans, this is where, the recovery from the French Revolution, this is where we sort of get where the order itself was saved in places like England and areas where Fenwick would come from, and the English and the Irish Dominicans. But the church in France, and after the French Revolution, the question was, how do we rebuild the order? Do we start something new? And the decision was, no, we have something, we're going to continue, just have to restore it, type of thing. But all but decimated.
When were the peak numbers of friars in the order? Was it right before the French Revolution?
Don't know, and I don't think so.
Okay.
I would say it's after.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And we'll get to that a little bit later.
There's a lot of them in 1300s. I think it was in the 1800s. It was the lowest it has, I think, ever been. Actually, even I think we're better now than we were at our lowest point.
I'm thinking of highest numbers.
Yeah, roll, yeah.
I don't know. So there was this. The French Revolution was very methodical and very intentional about adjudicating and instituting its agenda. And its agenda at its extremist was anti-monarchy and anti-church, anti-religion, anti-faith. So, and we can see a couple things that they did. For example, so not only is there's no more church, outlawed anything religious, they took the churches away, but they also then instituted in 1792 a new calendar. You guys actually have a copy of what that looked like. But so if you guys are going to ever be a dictator and you want to control and get your agenda across, there's a few things to do. One, there are three things. One, control language. So you see in Turkey in the 1920s, post World War I, Ataturk made Turkish written in Latin script instead of Arabic script, and sort of took control to modernize and bring it into the 20th century, which was meant also leaving behind certain things, the idea of the Ottoman Empire, etc. It's something new. Control education. You can control education by controlling history. Don't tell people their history, or just make education purely rote memorization. And then you can control things like calendars and other things. So for example, December 22nd, 1972 becomes the first day of a new calendar. It's abolished in 1805, so it lasts 13 years. This is about establishing completely, so it's like we need to wipe away everything of the old and establish a new social order based on Enlightenment ideals as they determined it. So the decimalization of the calendar, it's scientific, it's clean, it's mathematical. So there were 12 months of 30 days, right? None of this, was it January or April, June, and November, whatever, 31, and then 30 days has September, April, June, and November, all the rest of 31 except February that has 28. That is just so illogical, right? No, that's anti-scientific, that's anti-reason. Why would that be? So, we're going to, so 12 months of 30 days, which are basically 3 sets of 10. And then they got rid of the names of the days. Right? What are the days based on? So, for example, where does Thursday come from?
Thor.
Thor's day, right? Norse god. What about Wednesday?
Odin.
Yeah, Wotan's day. Wotan is the Germanic version of Odin, right? Friday?
Freya.
Freya, again, it's that Germanic, Nordic. Sunday, the day of the sun, Saturn's day, all of these things, no, this is based on old pagan religion, whatever. It's superstitious, it's myth. Let's just get rid of it. And so the first day, Femidi. Second day, Duodi. These are the names of the 10 days of the week. First day, second day, third day, fourth day, right? One day has 10 hours. 1 decimal hour is 100 decimal minutes. 1 decimal minute is 100 decimal seconds. It's metric, it's clean, base 10, easily doable. And so to have an understanding, so 1 decimal hour is roughly about 144 of our minutes. It's more than 2 times longer. One of their hours is 2 times longer than our hour. 1 decimal minute is about 86.4 conventional seconds, which is 44% longer. 1 decimal second is about 0.864 of our conventional seconds, which is 13.6 longer. But then you have
the second. You don't need to mess with the second.
anyway. But again, easily dividable. It's metric. It's clean. It's mathematical. It's scientific. And then they had the names of the months were based on nature, right? Observable, very concrete, natural things versus what is March named after?
Mars.
Mars, right? So, just for example, June is Juno. So no, and these names, for example, the month of Vendémiaire, which comes from the French of vendange, which is the vintage. It's the time of picking of the grapes for the vintage of wine. Pluvieuse, pluveux, the rainy season, the rainy month, starts in late January. Thermidor from the Greek thermon, which is the summer heat, starts at mid-July. So on this calendar that you see here, it was like a conversion calendar. You can see the 4 seasons, each of the 4 seasons of our seasons are broken up into 3 months of their seasons, right? So you can see some of the names, Germinal, Floréal, Prairial, in the upper right. You can see and you can manipulate this thing and figure out sort of if you were to map it with the old calendar, what the new one would look like. So you have those 30 days, et cetera, et cetera. They reset the calendar to year 1, right? So this is year 9, the way what this is depicting, which is equivalent to 1801. But you can just sort of begin to look at this and see some of what it's trying to depict. It's erasing any religious connotation very explicitly. And one of the things that it does, particularly the way it does these dates, is to absolutely obliterate Sunday. Sunday is meaningless. If you have a 10-day week, Sunday is meaningless. And that was designed to suppress the Christian cult, Christian worship, to stop worship, and to erase any royalist connections. So if you want to get rid of Christianity and really put an obstacle in its way, Sunday is just part of the week. It's in the middle of the week, right? It's not even hump day,
It keeps changing because
it keeps changing, right? Sunday means nothing anymore. Yeah.
I was wondering along that vein. So like you all know the way that the calendars that we have here in the US look. But I've seen like European calendars where they have Sunday stuck at the end of each week.
Mm-hmm.
Is that related? Like in terms of like a movement of sort of like secularizing, or is that just a different?
I think I would suspect that Sunday is actually it's more religious. Sunday's and the 7th day he rested. Beginning of the week is Monday. And how that shift works, but I think that's cultural convention.
Okay, so I didn't know if it was.
That would be my guess. But then you also have this, and you have an obliteration of history by resetting the calendar to year 1. No longer is this the Anno Domini, the year of our Lord. All of that, no, forget everything. Now, again, very methodical, very intentional.
I'm in shock. I don't know. I'm not kidding you. I say this, but At my age, you would think I would know all this, and I don't. I didn't know that at all.
This is really, 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 really important to understand, because this movement is going to inform the church's response after it ends. We're going to get to that the rest of today, but you might begin to understand why is the church suspicious of the Enlightenment or liberalism or modernist thinking. First, it had its experience with it in the Protestant Reformation and the blood and shed that happened. And now here, even more explicitly in a particular way, on a mass scale, it wasn't a Protestant Catholic thing anymore. It's just the church fighting for its own existence and its relevance in a society. And here you have very powerful movements that are actively a pogrom against the Catholic Church.
Just the Catholic Church, not
All of religion, but France, remember, is hyper-Catholic, and its whole identity is based, French identity is based in the church. Can't separate the two. So, and the thing is, a lot of these ideals, liberté, fraternité, égalité, these are the very ideals that the United States is founded on, right? Who was one of our great allies? Benjamin Franklin goes to whom for support? The French. 1776 was the Declaration of Independence, right? When was the Constitution finished? 1780 something?
87, I'm told.
1787.
Oh,
The revolution starts in 1789, right? There's a new show in on Apple TV. Michael Douglas plays Benjamin Franklin, but it's about his trip to France to secure an ally against the British at that era. You have famous figures like General Lafayette, right, who came and assisted, right? You have the Louisiana Purchase from the French. And so, yeah, and even we have a Declaration of Independence. We are promoting the rights of man, the citizen, self-determination, this whole experiment of democracy, right? That we, as Americans, hold as but these are the foundations. And religious freedom, right? A lot of this is based on the experiences of the Europeans that came over and the colonists. So we're already 100 years or so into, American society developing its own identities outside of its home countries in some ways, but still, what is this connection with Europe? But self-determination. So we get our own revolution against monarchies, for example. So you have the Boston Tea Party, the rallying cry, "Don't tread on me," right? The relationship with British Crown, right? All of these things are us too. In Great Britain, you're seeing a lot of this too. The parliamentary system started a lot earlier, but you begin to have the debate on what are ideals. And in many ways, it was a good part of it. One of these things that leads toward, in a positive way, this idea of liberty, fraternity, and equality is it questions the slave trade. Great movie called Amazing Grace, about Benedict Cumberbatch is in it, Albert Finney, about the whole movement in Britain to end the slave trade.
What is it called again?
Amazing Grace. But that idea that sort of revolution gets spread, it doesn't stay just in France, right? We even see it in Italy, which will have, sort of a more independent movements. But the revolution spreads, yeah. Pope Pius VI is taken prisoner by Napoleon in 1796. This is still in the middle of the revolution, after the Pope refuses to cede his power. So he's taken prisoner and he dies in exile in the south of France in 1799. Napoleon's a very interesting figure. The movie is an interesting movie. The recent movie by Ridley Scott, it's worth a watch. Not the best movie, but it's a pretty good movie. So yeah, this is happening. This is right at the turn of the century. What stops the revolution is basically the overthrow of the Jacobins in 1799, where Napoleon, though once a part of sort of this new regime, sort of takes and seizes power for himself and stops it, and overthrows the Jacobin regime. And that ends really the French Revolution. And he sort of establishes himself as emperor and begins the Napoleonic era. That's it. So remember, so the Pope dies in 1799. There's a new Pope, Pius VII, and there's the Concordat that he signs with Napoleon for the Church in 1801. And what does it say? There is no declaration of an official religion, as there was prior. Remember, Catholicism in France were like together. It's like mac and cheese. You can't have one without the other. But so there's no declaration that the official religion in France is Catholicism, but there is a recognition that the majority of the French are Catholic. And the Pope cedes a very big compromise. Napoleon would have say about who would be bishop, basically reviving lay investiture for the survival and the rebringing back of the church. It was an attempt to heal as a country, as a people, reestablish some structure and order of the church in France that had, remember, been all but decimated. We see similar situations and compromises or questions about, and what's the relationship between the Catholic Church and the Chinese government and the church in China. Right? It's an ongoing question. But here you have this relationship between the church and the state in some way, right? And what does that mean? Who's a real Christian and who has the authority to say so, right? What is the Pope's power? What is the Pope's role? Remember, the Pope was taken prisoner out of the Vatican, dies in exile. The church is all but decapitated. It's not just a French thing. It's about the universal church too. What is the role of a pope? Secular authority wielding a power over the church in very dramatic ways, and forceful ways. Note, the church is going to respond in its own forceful reaction, which is going to define the rest of the century. It's understandable, right? But you have this power dynamic around the authority about what is Christianity in a place, how is it practiced, etc. The aftermath of the French Revolution really is this question of, there was a great revulsion by the people at discovering what they were capable of as a people. The revulsion to the violence. And it was great, I think, happiness that it ended. But, they were so fired up on the eve of it, and they were so determined on their own ideals to achieve their end the way that they did it was with violence, right? We're going to see this again on the eve of World War One and then into World War One. Anyway, however, this was the outcome. So they said that was really bad. We don't want to do that again. But it didn't change the fact that those ideals, the good heart of it, freedom, equality, fraternity, right? The common man, the dignity of every person, those still stuck, right? Those were still there. And remember that these things have been now for 3 centuries, been fomenting and expressing itself. This is humanism. What about me? Right? And this is this call to a just society, you know, in all its levels. But we've seen now twice when people take matters into their own hands, when institutions can't or don't do what they're supposed to do, and we've already had 2 big, massive, bloody messes. So we had the 30 Years' War, right? And this is true of both Catholics and Protestants, political division, social divisions. We basically cut each other down. Okay, we didn't like that. And there were the great compromises, confessionalism, attempts at healing, attempts at restoring. But those ideals never left about the true calls to conversion to institutions and to people, right? Living. We saw the devotio moderna, and we even saw what would become the pietism, but that also led to Puritanism. We saw, a call to virtuous living, but we also saw that also toward Jansenism, right? We see these attempts because the ideals never leave. Those humanistic tendencies actually just continue to pervade into society and grow and evolve. This is another inflection, and those ideas don't leave. They linger. But the question is, how do we do this but avoid the bloodshed? And then becomes in the rest of the 1800s and up until Vatican II and even to today, it's still the question that we're fighting in its new evolved form, is how do we express these in ways that avoid the bloodshed? But this debate begins with, first, on the surface, are these ideals good in themselves? Right? Are these ideals good in themselves? And when you're in the midst of it, right in the middle of it, we have the advantage of the perspective of history, and we can look back. But you can begin to see the arguments that are made, whether yes or no, and who makes attempts at what. It makes perfect sense to say, no, these ideas are dangerous. Because look what they lead to, right? And that's one side of the argument. Versus, no, we just did it wrong. We need to do something different. And that both sides are going to make their claims and dig their heels in. And it will come to another inflection point again in World War I and World War II, and the revolutions that we see in the 20s and the late teens. I'd like to read a little bit about, so we move into this age of what we call liberalism and modernity. So liberalism is part of these ideals, self-determination, the freedom of self-determination. American democratic system is liberal in its nature. It's republican in its nature. It's liberal and republican. which means it's not monarchical, but it's based on liberal ideals of self-determination. Am I saying that right? More or less. So we cannot think of them as left-wing or right-wing. That doesn't become a thing until way later.
Republican in this case is referring to the mode of government, which
Yes.
is where you have representatives coming together
Yeah.
and ruling the party.
Yeah.
Which our modern Republican Party just happens to have the same name.
Correct. I have mentioned already John O'Malley several times, have I not?
Yes.
This is the period where his books are amazing, particularly his books on Vatican I and Vatican II. I just want to read a couple things about what he said about the fallout of the French Revolution. He says the French Revolution had been a traumatic experience, in some ways more traumatic than the Protestant Reformation, for it erupted in Catholic France. And its ripple effects were felt most keenly in other Catholic countries, like Spain and Portugal, as well as in the states of continental and peninsular Italy, which is a really funny thing. It's within the Catholic countries where these really exploded. In the Papal States, it also created a severe and protracted political crisis that centered largely on the Risorgimento, which was it's Italian for the resurgence. He said not only had the French Revolution shakenly and temporarily abolished the monarchies on the continent, but in doing so, it had also shaken to its foundation the old marriage of throne and altar, that is, state support of the Catholic Church to the exclusion of all others. Even more devastating was the ideology that carried these events forward. Behind the revolution lay the Enlightenment, which on the continent was rabidly anti-clerical, anti-Christian, and especially anti-Catholic. Some Catholics tried to come to terms with the new thinking, and their importance in what is termed the Catholic Enlightenment is now being increasingly recognized, yet they were relatively few. Modernity is a happy catchword for summing up what was at stake. The thinkers of the Enlightenment turned their backs on the past, turned their faces resolutely to the future, and this is a very important ideological understanding of what Enlightenment thinking and modern thinking is about, this absolute looking toward the future, and looked forward to even better things to come. Among those things was a new era of liberal equality and fraternity, liberty, equality, and fraternity. Religion and monarchy would no longer shackle the human spirit. Freedom of expression and freedom of the press were rights that could not be denied. No more religious dogma, for reason was the only God to be adored. No more hierarchy or privilege by reason of birth. No more kings, or at least no more kings without severe constitutional restraints. The list can go on, but progress toward a better future undergirded the mentality. Modernity implied, therefore, a view about historical change. Modernity was thus not simply the present state of things, the point in time at which life was now being lived. It had become an ideology, or perhaps several ideologies, all of them antagonistic in some measure to Catholicism. Liberalism was the name by which such passionately held views were commonly known in the 19th century. Especially for the papacy, liberalism stood for all that was wrong with the modern world. It stood for the philosophies responsible for overturning the right order of society and for causing morality to plummet to unheard of depths of degradation. Again, this idea of modernity is this turn away from the past, a hope of a brighter future, and the past being described as superstitious, obscurantism, this idea of that we were shackled, our intellects, our abilities, our potentials were shackled by faith what is it becomes rephrased under Karl Marx, right? Religion is the opiate of the masses, right? That is a subduing phrase. We're drugged, right? And therefore not in our right minds. That's that kind of ethos and that view. And the church saw it as a philosophical threat because its agenda was, as we have already seen, directly anti-Catholic, but it was also creating a social society where the church is absolutely irrelevant. God is irrelevant. And it was that this philosophy led twice to bloodshed. And it was a direct attack on the church, on the Catholic Church. Liberalism, again, had the revulsion of violence, but still held to the ideals. And what we then begin is let's try something. They held the ideals, but trying to continue to establish a society based on those ideals, but without the bloodshed. And you have the rise of nationalisms. It's the freedom of the individual from oppression, from control, from inequality, this society coming together for the common good, etc. And within the Catholic Church, there was Catholic liberalism. There was a Catholic liberal movement, Catholic liberal thinkers. Just like we had Catholic humanist thinkers, in the 1400s, the church, there were figures that tried to theologize around these principles in many ways, but tried to marry the two in some way. God and liberty, a free church in a free state, right? Is that possible? Right? And but that is also a call to no decadence, really, no corruption, right? We need this idea of the moral faults of institutions, greed, power hungry, pride, that the monarchies had become to be identified with, are these big old institutions, decadence and corruption, at the detriment of the everyday person. And prior to the revolution, many Catholic clerics embraced liberal ideals. After the revolution, it was a lot harder to hold on to those ideals because they saw where it led. So you had people who were like all gung-ho, yeah. So they were impelled by the righteousness of this idea of the dignity of the individual, and they're going to fight for it, sort of the social justice warrior type of thing. However, when that goes too far and leads to the revolution, they begin to hold back. Some of them do, are like, that's not what we wanted, right? It's harder to hold to these ideals because, again, there's then this existential question after you go through such a traumatic experience where you yourself then become attacked because you're a priest. You're killed, you're hunted down. It's sort of left, are these things in themselves actually good? These ideals, right? And to be able to separate or make the distinction between the good and the bad, maybe you couldn't, because maybe a sense of orthodoxy and nationalism and patriotism were so intertwined that you didn't know how to make the distinction. Sound familiar? Does this sound at all familiar to what's going on today? In the midst, you don't know, and some people weren't able to make those distinctions. But it's only going through a very traumatic experience that begins to maybe allow us to see those separations. You have a very famous Félicité Robert de Lamennais, who had a regular newspaper called L'Avenir. L'Avenir was a liberal newspaper, a liberal Catholic newspaper. L'Avenir literally means the future, what is to come, which again, Enlightenment ideals, liberal ideals, this idea of a brighter future, right? We're not looking backward, we're looking forward, and the liberal things of fraternity, liberty, equality. It was at the same time liberal and ultramontane. So ultramontanism. So remember, after the church falls, so we have this tension about, the Catholic Church, Gallicanism, the relationship of ecclesiastical structures and its tensions with Rome sort of collapse, and the figure of the Pope is beginning to regain a sense of a unifying factor, and you have these two things. You have the society in which you live and the faith that you hold. And the Pope becomes this unifying figure of the Catholic Church. Doesn't matter in what country. And then you begin to have these tensions then within yourself. The nationalism, the creating of a French nation, French ideals, liberal ideals. And the question is, where's my primary loyalty? Is it to the state or is it to the Pope? Is it to my faith or is it to my country? Right? And you begin to see these divides and these tensions between them. L'Avenir was a way of trying to bridge the two, both a connection with the Church Universal, but also this liberal ideals of how to organize a just society in a modern world. There are expressions and publications around the separation of church and state, democracy, freedom of conscience, but it was also anti-Gallican, anti-state church type of thing. It was anti-crown and altar. There were sort of two types of ultramontanism in that way. Wanting to restore the order between church and altar, or crown and altar, restore the monarchies and restore the old relationship, versus the ultramontanism of seeing but then you have liberal ultramontanism, the liberal ideals. So you have the confusion of two social structures. You have the ecclesiastical structure and the civil structure. You could be liberal on one, you could be anti-liberal on the other. You could be ultramontane or not ultramontane, right? What is the role of the Pope? What is your relationship with the church? What's the church's jurisdiction? So you have liberal and non-ultramontane, which becomes, we'll get to that in just a second, things like the French bishops almost declaring independence from Rome. French bishops establishing a French society, French church. What does this Italian guy have to do with us? Type of thing. So you begin to have these fracturings and these power dynamics. There's a very famous series of preaching. So if you were at all, the crème de la crème as a preacher, to be invited to give conferences at Notre Dame in the 1800s was the peak, right? And our brother, Henri Dominic Catholic gave a series of conferences at Notre Dame and articulated very well, and I think provides the most balanced and perhaps earliest of the expressions about bridging the faith with liberal ideals in a way that is faithful to both, which often can lay then the groundwork about a lot of how we understand the church today. That will come later in the 20th century, where what I will say is the church baptizes liberal ideals. But nonetheless, but it was an example of bridging efforts of these growing tensions. Thoughts, questions?
Could you re-explain the anti-crown and altar as an example of ultramontanism?
So, do you want crown back or no? So, post-French Revolution, you have the restoration of monarchy in some places. There's been like 3 France republics since the French Revolution, right? I think we're in the 3rd or 4th Republic of France because there was a democratic version, then monarchies came back, democratic version, monarchies come back, and all these sorts of things. It's part of French history. And remember this idea of Catholic identity and being French. French Revolution was a revolution not only against the church, but it was against the crown. So what's the solution after that? Do we go back to what it was before the revolution and reestablish the old thing? Because liberalism destroyed these 2 things. We need to bring those back, crown and altar, and therefore we need to have the Pope and king be in relationship, right? So it was anti that idea, right? So there's what is the Pope's role in reestablishing the French Church? But it was also anti an absolutist French Church alone. There has to be this tie with Rome in a particular way of the society, and not this sort of independent thing. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Is there another way to explain it? Is like you have liberal, yes, in which case you want democracy, or liberal, no, which is where you want a monarchy. And then there's also the ultramontane axis of what are your thoughts on the Pope? So Pope yes, Pope no. So you can get people who are like liberal ultramontane, where it's like we want a democracy, but we want to be super loyal to the Pope. Or you can get people who are ultramontane but monarchists, like no, we want a king, but we love the Pope the best.
So again, these are these different things, and this is all fallout. And these questions then, how do we organize ourselves? It's a big mess, kind of, and there's a lot of it. The society is working itself out through the century. I'm going to do this next section before we take a break. So you have in France attempts at trying to maintain the ideals, but reconcile, bridge sort of what was old too, but bring the church, but not have to abandon liberal ideals. But then there comes sort of on the official level, what I call Catholic entrenchment. You begin to have the backlash of the church institutional, where it basically is trying to stand up for itself. It digs its heels in and asserts its own authority as a reaction, like a parent almost punishing a rebellious teenager in many respects. It was a movement just simply beyond an opposition to the Reformation, but it was a movement sort of in opposition to the times. In his Vatican I book, O'Malley says, yes. Oh, I didn't do that paper there. Anyway, and the church institutional at its hierarchy and it, and that level, similarly to the way it treated the Reformation at Trent, it looked at, there's 2 issues at play. There's an issue of praxis and there's an issue of doctrine, practice and doctrine. And it had a lot of things that needed to be addressed. And so there was the doctrinal stuff, the philosophical stuff, the theological stuff, the pervasive influence of modernism and liberalism. It stood a staunch opposition to anything that reeked of modernity or liberalism. Again, it became the great opponent of it for the reasons of because we need to prevent another French Revolution. French Revolution was an evil, an existential threat to the good of human society, to the good of proper, good human social order. And these ideals, if left unchecked and unchallenged, lead to this. And it's already happened twice. So it went on the defensive against, or the offensive to try to really put guards around these ideals.
Are you saying Vatican I?
This is pre-Vatican I. This leads up to Vatican I. On the practice end are a lot of this sort of in the rise of this nationalism and a greater sense of my loyalty is more to my countrymen than it is to my faith, or those divided loyalties between, you know, a global ecclesiastical order versus, you know, my relationship with of the bishops together, or maybe the relationship again with local civil leaders, etc. In practice, you begin to have these sort of ideologies that are more about national identity, patriotism and national identity versus a union with the Pope. And so in France, it's called Gallicanism. In Germany, it's called Febronianism. In Austria-Hungary, Josephism, based on Emperor Joseph, the musical king, who's featured in Amadeus, the movie, Mozart. Again, and you even have that relationship of kings and monarchs in these areas, in these times, also pushing their own influence over the church. King Joseph, I read in Mozart's biography, banned public funerals. Banned public funerals. It's one of the reasons why Mozart was buried in a big pauper's grave. It was very just, we banned public funerals for a variety of reasons. There were political and theological tensions, you know, and the high emphasis, you know, these are religious, Gallicanism, Febronianism, Josephism, religious ideologies focused more on the local and national churches versus union with the Pope. There were a lot of the local liberties in practice, a lot of idea of idealizing and expressing and just doing self-determination.
So the church is coming in opposition to these movements, yes?
Mm-hmm. Because they reek of, you know, the Pope can be seen as a type of monarch. And still you have this anti-monarch, anti-establishment. We're going to be self-determining ourselves. We don't want some Pope over there to tell us what to do, right? And so it questions the Pope's place. And so you can have within the church these sort of more independent ideologies and independent self-expression. So a lot of local custom highlighted, promoted over and against anything that might be a unifying everything. We'll see later the existence of the Roman Missal as the universal missal as a way to stem local tradition and to quash these independent ideals. Anyway, so ultramontanism literally means over the mountain, so over the Alps, right? So you're on the continent, over the Alps into Italy. And ultramontanism, as an ideology, had very, very high notions of papal power and authority. So remember, when you have popular movement, or populist movements like liberalism, you know, and you have such a negative experience, you can hold on to and entrench yourself very rigorously and look, no, this is the vicar of Christ, the prince, he's the one, and sort of bequeath upon him a great sense of power and authority and influence, and becomes that great spiritual figurehead, unifying figurehead for no matter where you are in the church, as a reaction against a lot of that local independent sort of movements. Does that make sense? Are you seeing the dynamic at play? And it had political, social, and theological influences. And this was this big social. Remember, this is all of this stuff is swimming in the subconscious minds of everything and anything: politics, theology, economics, etc. But under it all is on whose side are you on? Are you patriotic or not? Whose side are you on? Again, we're seeing a lot of this being played out today, right? We'll get to this a little bit, but Americanism becomes a thing. And a great fear of Americanism, this sort of unholy alliance of American bishops and academics prioritizing patriotism over union with the Pope, being independent, reeking again of a lot of these old, more independent liberal ideals. Americanism is a phantom heresy. It never really existed, but it was a perceived fear. But we'll get to that a little bit later. But it really is that question: whose side are you on? On what side of history are you falling in this aftermath of the French Revolution? Yeah, where do you stand? And it was a great note of social tension. But this ultramontanism created a really, really interesting. Remember how, we've seen in the church the Pope having different kinds of power and authority to determine who is a Catholic or who is a Christian. Who is a real Christian, who has the authority to say so. A true Christian is one who is in union with the Pope. That's where this idea comes, that if you're in union with the Pope, you're a true Christian, because the Pope's authority is absolute, right? That's where this is where it stems. But that wasn't always true. Remember, we had that age of conciliarism, where the Pope was weak, and there was, the bishops, through councils, and we had all those councils. We've seen this tension at different times in the church. But the experience of the revolution, what it did, and Enlightenment and liberal ideals, in many respects, ironically, will in the end give the papacy the greatest amount of authority I think it has ever experienced over the church. And so O'Malley says something really interesting. He has another book called Church History for Today's Catholic Church. It's a really great book, How Our Past Illuminates Our Present. This book is sort of a more lay-friendly distillation of a lot of what he has done in his book on Vatican I and Vatican II. It's a lot of tidbits. So he says something like this: the changing role of the Pope in this ultramontanism. He says, in the 19th century, the popes added teaching to their job descriptions. They became teachers, or better put, they became teachers in a newly professed and more expanded way. Their principal vehicle for doing so was the encyclical. They used that medium to propose, expound, and elaborate moral, theological, and doctrinal positions in a virtually unprecedented manner. By definition, an encyclical letter is a circular letter and, as such, was used by popes and others from ancient times. But in the 19th century, its significance changed to such an extent that it emerged as a new genre. How does the modern encyclical differ from previous genres favored by the popes for their pronouncements? The premise generally underlying earlier genres like bulls and briefs was that the pope was either a judge or a dispenser of favors. He decided cases among contending parties. As St. Thomas put it, it is the pope's job finaliter determinare, that is, to act as the court of final appeal. He conferred benefits, issued executive orders regarding liturgical practices and similar matters, and on relatively rare occasions on his own, condemned heretical and offensive opinions. Insofar as the Pope taught, he did so for the most part in a negative way by condemning a wrong opinion. Although there were many exceptions, popes generally did not provide a correct opinion or develop alternatives. Pope Leo X's condemnation of Luther in the bull Exsurge Domine is a famous instance. It is nothing more than a list of Luther's errors. The papal encyclicals that developed in the 19th century certainly did not hesitate to condemn errors, but also elaborated on topics as would a teacher in a classroom. Even so, in the Middle Ages and early modern period, popes rarely on their own issued condemnations like Exsurge Domine. That task fell to local or general councils, and after the 13th century, to the theological faculties of the universities. Remember, the faculties of Paris, Louvain, and Cologne condemned Luther independently of Leo X. The Pope's increased use of the encyclical is indicative of its growing importance. From the two issued at the end of the 18th century by Pope Pius VI over the course of 24 years, and the one issued by his successor over a 23-year pontificate, we moved to 38 by Pius IX in the mid-century, and then to 75 by his successor, Leo XIII. So here we have the Pope exercising a different kind. It's a spiritual authority. It's not just sort of a judicial authority. He's now taking on his own, right? Where were some of doctrine espoused? Remember, this is where we see in scholasticism. It was for the academics, et cetera, et cetera. It wasn't necessarily seen as the Pope's role, but all of a sudden that centralizing power and looking to the Pope for teaching is a shift. And as also a sort of, in a kind of a way, a political figure to fight and defend the people of the church and the church's own dignity and autonomy in amidst a society. Pope Gregory XVI, who died in 1846, in his Mirari Vos, he blamed rebellion on the conspiracy of evil men, shameless lovers of liberty. You know, he said that freedom of speech, freedom of the press, separation of the church and state, freedom of conscience, these were absurd, erroneous, and a delirium. The solution? Obedience to legitimate princes. Pope Pius IX, who dies in 1878, who is the successor to Pope Gregory XVI, was also known as Pio Nono, which was a pun. Nono for 9, Pius IX, but then no, right? And he had his famous Syllabus of Errors, which I gave to you guys. Hopefully you had a chance to look at it, which he published in 1864. He was born in 1792, in May of 1792. It was December of 1792 that the French Revolution put out the new calendar. The Church of Pope Pius IX was a post-French Revolution church. He knew no other church except the church in the wake of the French Revolution. Think about, Pope Francis being the first post-Vatican II pope. Or the first pope that wasn't at Vatican II. That's more accurate. But that pope that will know no other church outside of a Vatican II church, we have yet to get there, but could very well be in the next papacy. Um, I think that's a really important context. And remember, all of these ideologies going around, there's still great antagonism. And remember what the church experienced. And that the church was putting direct blame on these ideologies. And so the syllabus of errors is a collection of those, was it 39 papal encyclicals? They're basically, it's a collection of these condemnations. Right? He says, to think these things, these are errors. It is erroneous to think that all action of God and man in the world is to be denied. It is erroneous to see that as human reason is placed in the level with religion itself, so theological must be treated in the same manner as the philosophical sciences. Or he goes through and categorizes them under different sort of doctrinal ideological things, and he's saying this is against the faith, this is an error, this is an error. And he goes and just starts listing them, and they're all quotes from his encyclicals that are in dialogue with this post-revolution society where the antagonisms still lie, that are trying to find itself, and it's this sort of entrenchment, and it is saying it's a direct parrying with these underlying philosophies that still continue, and he is worried about another French Revolution. He's worried on his doorstep because we'll see you have the sort of liberal ideals in Italy coming from the north seeking to depose the church and the church influence in Italy.
I was wondering about the rest of the world, besides France.
This is happening, yeah. But it's not just France. So remember, the revolution spreads, but these are the dynamics at play. And again, you have this practice and doctrine and these ideologies and saying what's actually being lived out and what are the consequences and the church's institutional memory of what happened. He was born in the middle of the French Revolution, even though he was Italian.
Can you clarify this for me? Okay, so the three, I don't know what you'd call it, like that when you think of the French Revolution, at least before this class, I thought of liberty, yes. Fraternity, oh yeah. And
Equality.
we've struggled with that. But I'm hearing you say that the church is against that? I couldn't, okay, thank you.
This is the 1800s. We have to get to next week. But the church, remember, and it's going to take time. It's not until after Vatican I that the church puts its entrenchment thing aside and then goes on the offensive, or what I would call then baptizes the liberal ideals, but with its authority and magisterial teaching begins to tell the world, not the Enlightenment anti-church way, but through the reasoned church understanding of intellect, what these actually mean, and thus begins Catholic social teaching. And that begins with Leo XIII. And that leads to the Council of Vatican II. But what we have first in this great, remember, we have to think of the church's reaction in long swaths, and it's dealing with the realities in the middle of all of this, right? What's happening in the 1800s? You have the War of 1812, right? You have the Napoleonic Wars. You have all of these things that are sort of up and going, and there's still life is happening. But these ideals are coming in, and it's not all to the good. And again, the church just experienced, based on these ideals, the direct attack that these ideals and fundamentally want to lead to God means nothing. Christ means nothing. The church means nothing. And we must defend her and God in a society hell-bent on destroying it. That was, you can understand it when you put in that reason. Did they do it well? You can communicate that in rhetoric in different ways, but that's sort of what it was trying to do. And this entrenchment, no, it was defense of the gospel in many ways. Because what were they saying? It's similar to what we had with liberation theology in the 20th century, right? You had this sort of backlash against liberation theology because why? It's sort of tied because those who espoused liberation theology often ended up promoting violence. Not that say that their intention of the dignity of the human person was wrong, but it was suspect because of how people carried it out. And the church needed to probe it, examine it, based on experiences about how people were using it, which was violence, which was often anti-church, anti-God, or anti-whatever, or prioritizing oneself over that of other things. And so the church can first sort of defend against and say, no, this is not good. These are not the things, versus the proactive, well, what is it we actually teach, right? In the 20th century, so we see, okay, to hold these ideas, and if you read these lists, right, you can see it's good, but at the same time, when you read it in the context in which it was put in, and that dialogue and that experience, it makes sense. It makes sense where a society is trying to abolish the church. And so to hold these things, these are erroneous. It doesn't go on the offensive until it says, okay, we begin with Catholic social teaching. You can look at the 60s and 70s and 80s in the same way, and a lot of the liberation movements in Western society in the United States. And we can see possibly as, Humanae Vitae as a big no-no, and no, that is, you can't have that, no, and putting these blocks in and saying no, as some people perceive it, or no to this kind of sexuality, or no to this kind of ideology, etc. But then when does the church actually do a proactive, positive thing? This is where something then John Paul II's whole project of theology of the body, the church has not given a positive explanation in the vein of Leo XIII, of Catholic social teaching, on the church's teaching on what a human person is in a positive sense. What does the church say about this instead of being always on the defensive and the negative, being on the positive? And so John Paul II is bringing that out, right? Anyway, does that make sense?
If I could add something, that's one of the things that people like Lacordaire they were trying to answer the question of. So you have these ideals of liberty, equality, fraternity. Do they necessarily lead to violent revolutions like happened in the French Revolution? And another important piece of historical context is that after the French Revolution, like Napoleon is defeated and then Europe tries to like maintain peace, there are repeated revolutions where people try to violently, assert these republican ideals and are fighting back. So that colors not only the church's response to a lot of these, but a lot of governments. There are some governments that potentially they're like, maybe we can try a little bit of democracy as a treat, and then there's all these revolutions that crop up. We're like, no, we want more, and then they're like, okay, that was a bad idea. Nobody gets any treats.
And remember, then you think of sort of the prescience of Benjamin Franklin. We've given you democracy if you can keep it, right? I think that that's a very telling of a sense of a society and the dubiousness. And yeah, we could take for granted our understanding of where we are now, That's sort of always been or on firm ideological foundations. That is a very recent thing, 200 years. It's recent in the grand scheme of things. It's still new. And I think part of what we're experiencing now is you have populist movements rebelling against institutions. This side, but this time from a different side of the spectrum. You see that populist movements again. We'll see it in World War II. Communism being one side, fascism being on another side. They're populist movements that seize control over and against what they see as oppressive things that prevent flourishing. And so the question is, where's the church's role in this? Both fascism and communism want to stamp out religion, right? Anyway, let's take a quick break, and then we're going to go with a little bit of happy notes. So yeah, let's take a quick break. It's funny, David Brooks just dropped a op-ed. He says, "Can we please stop calling these people populists?" And I just called them populists.
No.
Yeah, in a certain sense, popolo, they are the people.
Yeah.
Who are
I will just sign up at the beginning of all 27
It's in the letter of Jude. One goes for Jude.
Are you kidding me?
I'm asking everybody, and I haven't signed it myself.
There's nothing stopping both of them.
Third
It's not in the
John.
same book.
Oh, Brother Albert is in the same company.
Oh,
That's right, you might see others.
Well, that was my question. So yes.
So let us continue. As is true in every age, particularly when Molly is the most scandalized about the church. And wondering, is this the worst of all times? We're at another one of those inflection points. You know, it is, and again, I hope you're seeing this throughout the entirety of this class. There's this both and, right? And there are these ripples and waves. This was not the worst of times. There was actually an incredible Catholic revival. So after, as we saw in post-Reformation, a great Catholic revival. Post-French Revolution, there was a great Catholic revival. Pope Leo XII in 1825 declares that Jubilee year. And in that Jubilee year, he basically revives a Reformation era sort of practice of having a parish mission. No parish missions?
Yeah.
No little fervorinos. These ideas are these gatherings of the faithful to reinvigorate the faith, a revival, right? And promoted and encouraged local churches to go to revive the faith of the people, to reestablish and make them love their faith. Again, these ideas of a mission has its origins in the post-Reformation Catholic counter-Reformation, right? We see these, in the post-Reformation France, and we have a lot of these sorts of groups like the Vincentians and the Saint-Sulpice and these things about invigorating in the faith. We're going to live the faith. And this very just expression of the faith and reanimating it. In the post-French Revolution, you have in Europe this sort of great resurgence between 1815 and 1830 of the practice of missions. These gatherings of the faithful, like think of praise and worship, and where you have really great fervorino on the faith, and you walk out and your Lent is that much deeper because you went to the great parish mission and you're edified. And it has a lot of its origins in Alsace. I don't call that either France or Germany at this point. It will go and switch hands many times between now and then. Switzerland, Italy, and people from France and Germany would cross the borders to attend these missions. Right? It was this popular thing that had a lot of energy, to it. In the U.S., there was very low practice of the faith among Catholics in this era. A lot of people were leaving the faith. There were few priests. There was spiritual malaise, partly perhaps with its relationship with its Protestant neighbors, and there's that underlying antagonism that still existed. Remember, we talked briefly about like Maryland being a Catholic state versus, a Quaker state of Pennsylvania or whatever. There were not many parishes. Remember, the United States is vast in geography, right? Very scattered populations. Missions and mission preaching was a way to revive the faith. We should consider where we sit right now. Denver and St. Dominic Priory was an outpost for a band of preachers going around preaching missions in the 1800s, late 1800s, right? It was a way of bringing the faith. But this is the era of, so what you had, the United States is expanding greatly, right? This great movement to the West. you the Catholic Church in the United States was bringing over priests and stuff from Europe to be missionaries in the United States and to help supply. That's why in the United States, to have parishes run by religious orders um, is a kind of a common thing. In Europe, that's not the case, right? But it was the religious who sent their missionaries and who established. And part of the requirements for bishops, you come here, you guys have to take parishes. That's what we need, right? And so this relationship and this sort of melding of sort of a diocesan kind of ecclesial living, which is not necessarily what was needed in Europe. That happened here. So we have to think in our own Dominican history, Edward Dominic Fenwick, the first bishop of Cincinnati, Allegheny, first bishop of San Francisco. We have to think Mazzucchelli, Samuel Mazzucchelli. Think Bardstown, Kentucky. Bardstown was a big center of the Catholic Church. It was at the time sort of a center metropolis of sorts, but it gets fizzled away and doesn't become that in the end. But Mazzucchelli's memoirs is an incredible historical primary source, a lens into the United States and religious practice at this era. Mazzucchelli's first parish, so he was brought over, so Edward Dominic Fenwick is made Bishop of Cincinnati. He goes to Santa Sabina in Italy and says, I need priests to come over and take, etc. And Mazzucchelli, a young, precocious 21-year-old, newly ordained, says, okay, I'll go. Brings over. And Fenwick names him pastor of the parish, and his parish was Michigan and the Western United States. That was his parish, right? A lot of undefined territory. And Mazzucchelli traveled a lot. We think Michigan, Wisconsin, Iowa, even down to St. Louis, but established the Church in the Midwest, which is our province. He founded the Cincinnati Dominican Sisters. He built Iowa City, I believe. Yeah, he basically planned it and built it. But he was also in the era of, he met Joseph Smith. He talks about holding debates with his Protestant neighbors and the antagonism with Protestant pastors and hosting debates. He was very opinionated himself in many respects. But you have this sort of view into that lifestyle and that society, right? Of what is the practice of the faith. And figures like Mazzucchelli are really, really important. And he was on horseback. He translated the Bible into Winnebago for the Native Americans. He was a 21-year-old and he figured out architecture and construction and built churches with his own hands.
That's kind of saying, dang it.
Right.
We have top men working on it.
We have top men working on it.
And he
So-
was 21 when he started?
Yeah. When he was brought over.
Look at all of us slackers.
I know. What have you accomplished in your life? I know.
Still got some time.
And that, but so this is sort of in the United States, right? And this relates with this idea of missions and this preaching and this revivification. And that so many missionaries were coming. You think about all the Irish priests, the Italian priests, all the whatever coming over. That is very indicative of the revival of the faith and church in Europe. Vocations booming, right? Post-French Revolution. You have in France a revival of the religious life and sort of, so you have two things sort of going on. And this, remember, the church was outlawed. Churches were taken away or destroyed. Clergy were killed or exiled. Religious orders, again, just disappear. You have then this movement to restore, to go back and bring back to life, to nurture that soil, to revive religious life both as in our context, but in popular piety context. And this is where we begin to have what is the beginnings of the liturgical movement, which will have its fruition in Vatican II. And then the revival of just a lot of the documents and the constitutions that order what 20th century religious life, convents, monasteries, etc., and how they organized and lived their life out based on this revival. So you have Guéranger and in Solemn Abbey sort of reinstituting, this idea of this sort of the sacred religious order. It's very pious, very ritualistic, very devotional, very rigorous, very ultramontane. It promoted the Latin rite over and against the Gallican rite, right? So you have this promotion of a unifying rite for all Catholics despite their nationalism. Gallican rite is for French by French, a Febronian rite for Germans by Germans, the Josephite rite for Austrians by Austrians, right? These sort of very localized custom stuff, but him promoting a more unified rite, a Latin rite that isn't based on language or culture group, but based on this unifying thing of the faith that is rooted in where the Pope becomes that symbolic center, that we are this Latin tradition, this Latin root based in Rome, right? The Mass and the Liturgy of the Hours become the center of worship versus local devotions, right? Local devotions being to like Mass and Liturgy of the Hours. We talk about them today as the official prayers of the church, right? That's the centering thing, over and against things like Stations of the Cross or other pieties of the medieval era that often have local custom, right? There is a restoration of Gregorian chant from obscurity. So versus what we would say the quote unquote tainted classicism of Mozart, Bach, etc. I just had a recent conversation with some people, when we talk about liturgical music in the church today, what's appropriate, what's not. Why is Matt Maher's very popular music, or the stuff that we see here on Catholic radio or music, Christian radio stations, why isn't that played in the church, right? In this day, it was like Mozart was the Matt Maher of the day. What's the role of popular musicians, composers in sacred space, right? What's promoting a unity versus a local culturalism, right? There's these tensions, but this trying to revive and have a more unifying thing, an expression. Gregorian chant, no one knew it. We have this idea that the church always had Gregorian chant. No one knew it at this time. It was obscure. It wasn't this big, pervasive everything. It's revived in the middle of the 1800s and promoted as the centering way of celebrating Liturgy of the Hours, etc. And we've carried on a lot of this sort of cultural argument for Gregorian chant as the true and the sacred, etc., etc. That is a leftover ideology from the middle of the 1800s and the liturgical reform post-French Revolution, FYI. Not saying that Gregorian chant is bad or not beautiful or doesn't have a place in liturgy. What I am saying is that we have to be careful about the intentions why we hold such a thing. And that comes from an argument that's based in this social dynamic and political dynamic and ideological dynamic. FYI. And that's not what the church always did. So, And there was just, in general, this, on the eve of Vatican I, Vatican I being 1869 and 1870, there was a vibrant living of the faith. Here's what O'Malley says. He's so good as a writer. In the areas of Catholic Europe in 1869, on the eve of the council, churches were full. Men and women and children participated with obvious sincerity in rich variety of religious devotions, including public processions, pilgrimages to local shrines. New religious orders of women had sprung up, and vocations to the priesthood were plentiful. One of the religious orders that arose post-French Revolution, the Little Sisters of the Poor, for example. Nuns and priests were leaving Europe in large numbers to spend their lives in foreign missions, especially with little prospect of ever returning home. Such phenomena were not deceptive. Almost everywhere the Catholic Church found itself, it showed remarkable vigor. By 1870, the Church numbered perhaps as many as 200 million members, of whom 3/4 lived in Europe. Membership was especially concentrated in 4 areas: France, Italy, Austria-Hungary, and the Iberian Peninsula. With about 37.5 million Catholics and a total population of 38 million, France was the strongest Catholic nation. By mid-century, it sent 2/3 of all missionaries leaving from Europe. 2 decades later, it numbered 1 nun for every 350 inhabitants of the country. Isn't this the era of Therese?
She's like 1880 to
A little after.
1905, something like that.
Although sharply divided ideologically, France led the church in new Catholic initiatives, which flowed from there to the rest of the church. But in Spain, Italy, and traditionally Catholic area of German-speaking lands, the populations showed themselves similarly devoted to their Catholic heritage and ready to meet the challenges of the day. This figure is all the more remarkable when viewed against the background of 50 years earlier. So think of 1975. That's the distance that we're talking about. The French Revolution and its pan-European Napoleonic aftermath had traumatized the Catholic Church, and the revolution became ever more radical. It turned anti-Catholic, etc., etc. Despite all, the church survived and emerged from the trauma as stronger and more vibrant than ever. It faced, however, new and extraordinarily difficult challenges. It included dramatic social changes resulting from the Industrial Revolution, from the new means of transportation and communication, such as railroad and the telegraph. It included intellectual changes emerging from the newly critical approaches to the past, which did not spare sacred texts and sacred traditions. The Enlightenment, in the scheme of church's history, modernity was not simply a designation of the present state of affairs, or I think I already read this. The present is better than the past, and sooner the past is forgotten, the better for all. But anyway, this description of a very vibrant church on the eve of the council, on top of the ideological entrenchment, right? And perhaps the structural challenges, the political challenges within the church and without the church, the faith was also very vibrant. And in 1869 and 1870, Pope Pius IX, Pio IX, calls Vatican I. And in many respects, the church is fighting for itself. It's fighting to establish and assert its own authority, particularly through the person of the Pope. It's the council to deal with the French Revolution and modernity, the church in the New World. That's what the purpose of the council was. The previous council was when?
Trent.
Trent. Called to deal with the church post-Reformation, Vatican I. And it argues against, at that conciliar level, and reestablishing the council as the full expression of the church's authoritative teaching, but argues against the radical notions of reason, because it's not just Catholicism at risk. Theism itself is at risk. A belief in God is at risk. And it's trying to argue against the most radical notions and the worst consequences of the Enlightenment with regards to science, scripture, theology. Remember, some of the scriptural things, again, this idea, miracles are not possible because they're not natural, and therefore anything that references a miracle, just cut it out of the Bible. Snip, snip, snip. Right? But then it also, because you have the rallying cry in the person of the Pope, in many respects, this is sort of the other side of the coin of Charlemagne and Pope Zachary. Right? Zachary? I always get confused. Is it Zachary? No, Leo, who crowns Charlemagne. Leo III. Where you have the Pope as ecclesial institutional head and representative versus Charlemagne as civil institution head. Here you have again the Pope as this great ecclesial spiritual institutional head and asserting its authority over and against a society, a civil secularization that wants to claim authority over it, right? And the council is an expression. No, the church has an authority and is trying to reassert itself. It asserts and centralizes this authority of the church in Rome and the Pope. It puts high, stringent limits on local liturgies, particular liturgies. It's interesting that it was centered in Rome. When was the last time we had a council in Rome? Never.
Lateran 5. Right?
Lateran 5. Yes. Take that back. That was the 1200s. No, 1500s. Right before the Reformation. But Trent wasn't in Rome. Right? Trent is in Italy, Germany-ish area. You have, but the other big places, where does the church center itself? Call itself? Here, to put it right there in the Vatican, not just the seat of Peter at John Lateran, but at the Vatican. But it was also an incredibly multi-ethnic participation of the bishops of all over the world. So you had this sort of ultramontane gathering of the great diversity in the church, in this new world church, right? In Trent, you really didn't have representatives from Africa and the Americas and Asia represented there, but here you have this multicultural, multi-ethnic expression. But they all come to Rome as that centralizing, unifying place, symbol, and embodied in the person of the Pope. And you have, therefore, sort of two documents come out of Vatican I in this assertion of itself in the modern world of its day. I would say Vatican II, when Vatican II started, the first question it had to ask itself, is this a continuation of Vatican I, or is this something new? Because Vatican I actually, so one of the first things that Vatican II did was end Vatican I. But in some sort of ceremonial way. But again, because Vatican II was also a council about the church in the modern world, right? It's the other side of the coin. So to see these two together in this way is a really interesting thing, and not as sort of separate antagonistic things, but two sides of the church expressing itself in light of the times, in the modern world, of the shifting ideologies, the shifting perspectives, and what is the church's relevance, and asserting its place and making the claim of its place, right? Vatican I establishes its authority over against in this sort of a defensive entrenchment. Vatican II is the positive expression. So we get things like Lumen Gentium, the Declaration on the Church. What is the church? What is it for? Dei Verbum, on the role and place of Scripture. Sacrosanctum Concilium, right? And presents in a very positive way the church's understanding of these elements of itself, its hierarchy, right? Its relationship with non-Catholics, right? Whether they be Protestant or non-Christian, non-baptized persons, the Jews. It has a document on religious freedom, etc. That's Vatican II. But what you have first, again, with this sort of defensive nature, this entrenchment aspect, it deals with a lot of the ideological, theological, doctrinal, philosophical issues of faith, reason, and the intentions behind these ideologies. You know, it tries to argue for the reasonability of God, the nature of truth and revelation. Because revelation as an idea is just completely dismissed out of hand prima facie. And the fundamental truth of the primacy of God's church and her magisterium, teaching authority, right? Because that was being questioned. The church has nothing to teach, has no authority to teach anything because it has no claim to truth because it's based in unenlightened things, superstition, obscurantism, miracles, you know, etc. So this is the document Dei Filius, the Son of God, that deals with these questions. It's a question of doctrine. So remember, Trent had those two tensions, right? What is right belief and right practice? Orthodoxy, orthopraxis. Doctrine, practice. Trent had those two things. Those two things were at play from the French Revolution on, and here we have these two documents that are responses to both of those. This is the doctrine side. And so let's just look at some of its. So here are numbers 5, 6, 7, and 8 of Dei Filius, which was promulgated in 1870. Everybody knows that those heresies condemned by the Fathers of Trent, think Protestant Reformation and things, which rejected the divine magisterium of the church and allowed religious questions to be a matter of the judgment of each individual, have gradually collapsed into, so it's reflecting on what's the consequence of some of this thinking, right? And it's recognizing this is one of the consequences. Multiplicity of sects, either at variance or in agreement with one another, and by this means a good number of people have had all faith in Christ destroyed. The consequence of the infighting, 30 Years' War, fueled this Enlightenment liberal that religion doesn't lead to anything good. Indeed, even the Holy Bible itself, which at one time claimed to be the sole source and judge of the Christian faith, is no longer held to be divine. They begin to assimilate it into inventions of myth. So you had the Protestant argument, sola scriptura. Now it's just like, scripture, what? It's a myth, right? It's not divine. It's a book made by humans, for humans, and that's its only value as a cultural museum piece. Thereupon there came into being and spread far and wide throughout the world that doctrine of rationalism or naturalism, utterly opposed to the Christian religion, since this is of supernatural origin, Christian religion being of supernatural origin, which spares no effort to bring it about that Christ is shut out from the minds of the people and the moral life of nations. Thus, they would establish what they would call the rule of simple reason of nature. The abandonment and rejection of the Christian religion and the denial of God and his Christ has plunged the minds of many into the abyss of pantheism, materialism, and atheism. And the consequence is that they strive to destroy rational nature itself, to deny any criterion of what is right and just, and to overthrow the very foundations of human society. With this impiety spreading in every direction, it has come about, alas, that many, even among the children of the Catholic Church, have strayed from the path of genuine piety, and as the truth was gradually diluted in them, their Catholic sensibility was weakened. Led away by diverse and strange teachings and confusing nature and grace, human knowledge and divine faith, they are found to distort the genuine sense of the dogmas which Holy Mother Church holds and teaches, and to endanger the integrity and the genuineness of faith. That's the fear. That's what it's writing about. Now, you may, in our contemporary sensibilities, feel this is maybe too dramatic. Maybe not. You don't know, but I think it is indicative when you put it into the context of what it's saying. It has a point. It has a valid point that it will not be silent on, even when everybody else is sort of drinking the juice. Everybody's drinking the juice. And though what we will see in the 20th century, the church beginning to distinguish between the good parts of the Jews versus the bad parts of the Jews, right? It's trying to keep on the sort of the whole surface and not let it be buried by mob rule or mob think, or just that everybody accepts it, therefore it's true. Real critiques that have to be there, right? And the consequences thereof. And it can do so in a very dramatic and forceful kind of way. But it has a point. We have to admit it has a point. Pastor Ternus deals with the sort of the praxis end of things and asserts papal primacy. It is a staunch statement of authority. It proclaims the perpetuity of Petrine primacy and papal infallibility. What is papal infallibility? That the Pope speaks does not make it infallible, right? It is though when the Pope speaks ex cathedra, meaning defining a doctrine regarding faith and morals, right? And that there is an infallibility, and when the Pope teaches, you are bound by obedience to accept, right? And I think the idea of it really being as the gatekeeper for people in a time with, the guidance of the Holy Spirit, as we believe is imbued in the office, then certain things, despite what everybody else might think, it's sort of a check and a balance. And it was a debate. Not everybody wanted to accept it. When you read the Vatican I book by John O'Malley talks about the debate about how far do we go, how far do we don't, et cetera. What are the spectrums of ultramontanism and liberalism, and where the compromises. However, the idea to have sort of a check over the popular think seems necessary. And that there is a theological argument in Petrine primacy. Upon this rock I will build my church. And a case for this. How often has papal infallibility actually been invoked?
At least twice.
Only twice, from what I understand. One was to establish papal primacy. What was the other time?
The dogma of the Assumption.
Of the Immaculate Conception.
I think the Assumption as well.
It was the Assumption?
I think so.
Conception was before.
Okay,
Okay, so it would be the assumption.
yeah, that's it. So there's not, we might have in our populist, individual, liberal, the Pope, we all those Catholics just believe anything the Pope says. And then they take it as in their uncritical thinking because he's infallible and anything that he says is true. It's not the truth, but we have these ideas and these sentiments and can have those because we inherit a cultural critique and a cultural self-determination against this. Is that really what this was saying? And we can receive a narrative about these things because we're also receiving the narrative of what was good and just from our foremothers, with regards to liberal ideals versus religious piety, the idealization of individualism and autonomy and self-determination over and against those things that would seek to enslave the human spirit, such as obedience, dogmas, magisteriums, and institutions, right? And these are at play, that we are born into and will perdure through the 20th century. Again, we have this papal primacy in light of, again, these movements within nationalistic cultures, Gallicanism, Febronianism, Josephism, etc. And like I said earlier about this, Americanism. Americanism was a post-council. It was a post-council fear or heresy, where there was a fear on the part of Rome and Europe, of the U.S. bishops and clerics teaching liberal and modern ideas, particularly in colleges and universities, that went against the syllabus. Right, that there was this open promotion of these ideals in a particular way. It was a phantom heresy, not rooted in reality, but also you have what is Europe's perception of Americans, right? What is Europe's perception of American academia, of American ecclesiastic makeup, personalities? And Europe and the United States have not necessarily always been in congruence. Especially within the church. The idea, why can't we have an American Pope or US Pope? The Italians won't stand for that. Right? A lot of Europe won't. Right? So anyway, there's a lot of those things at play. And I think we as an American Catholic Church do suffer from a bit of a Americanism. And you see this in a lot of different ways. If you look at, with the elections of Benedict and the elections of Francis, and you watch interviews they're doing with American Catholics about who they hope the next pope is or whatever. You look at the liturgical fights, you look at a lot of these sorts of things and you read the documents, you read, public statements by priests and bishops and others, and you can look at the two different kinds of newspapers. There is a sense of us adjudicating our own particular culture war comes across as us saying, what we know of the church and the way we experience the church and the way we want the church is the way the church must be universally. And we tend to project onto the whole of the church universally the ideals that are being informed by our particular cultural context. And there's a lot of reaction against that by people outside of the US. It's a different kind of form of imperialism of sorts. And it has had influence, particularly in the latter part of the 20th century, on European ecclesiology and even political cultures, in Italy, for example. But anyway, so this is Vatican I. It's an attempt, it's sort of the end of an entrenchment, not an end per se, but it's a great expression of this entrenchment, this defense of the church, this defense against forces, ideologies, cultural movements, attitudes that want to push the church aside, and establishes both in doctrine and praxis its authority. It seeks to. That's the context of it. After it's done that, and we'll see in the 20th century, it then begins the work which it hadn't had before in a more proactive, go on the offense of teaching and adjudicating these questions, these humanistic ideals and these ideals of liberalism, but on its own terms and not on the terms of the popular movements. And this is where we get the foundations of Catholic social teaching. This is where we get the foundations of biblical scholarship, right? The church had been always saying, if you look at the syllabus of errors, to say this about Scripture, that's wrong. To say this about Scripture, the church hadn't been producing or in any way engaging these ideals and confronting them head on. It just was making these statements, these blocks. No, that's not right. That's not right. No. And then it goes out and says, okay, we're going to play your game. And so we had the foundations of the École Biblique, for example, and things like that. The rise of neo-scholasticism is another thing that happens. The liturgical movements, etc. So, Pope Pius dies in 1878. The Vatican councils stop because the do I talk about this? Basically the Italians and this whole Italian resurgence take over the Papal States. And for the first time since the founding of the Papal States, what class did we talk about the founding of the Papal States?
I forget, but what are the Papal States? Or what were they?
Do you remember when we talked about this?
It was a tract in central Italy where the Pope held temporal authority as the ruler of a country, if you will.
A territory. So this was at the time of the Merovingians and the Carolingians. Pepin, Charles Martel, Charlemagne. The Carolingians became allies with the Pope. This is where Pope Zachary is. Against the Merovingians, who were the ruling class and the ruling family of France. This is the 700s. And part of that allyship, where the Carolingians overthrow the Merovingians, they give them territory in Italy. And the Papal States are territory, sovereign territory, of whom the Pope is the sovereign.
No, I knew that.
Yeah, and so those are the Papal States.
But
Those
what
are
are they like?
Now today,
Yeah,
they no longer exist.
I know, but I mean, they're still part of Italy.
Yeah,
But what?
The central part of it.
the central obstacle and an enemy. And this Italian movement is based on these ideals of anti-monarchy, establishing itself a unified democratic Italy, liberal Italy, and therefore the church is under direct attack. And at the council, Rome is taken, the Papal States are abolished. The first time in over 1,000 years, the church's identity was one of Papal States until that moment. And so we talk about this existential threat and why the church might speak very rigidly about its authority and its place. It's because it was feeling threatened, right? Legitimately, in some ways. The French Revolution was not ended, and these ideologies are seeking to overthrow the church. Right? It's a real living fear. Us separated from it, can maybe be a little desensitized from it, but that is the reality. And so I think we need to realize that. But thus begins then, after 1870, a whole new identity and identity of what is the church, right? All of a sudden, it's this world where the Vatican becomes it's its own sovereign little thing, but that's it. In the middle of Rome, it's an identity shift. It's an existential shift for the church's understanding of its place in society. And that those elements of the church itself that want to retain its sense of maybe imperial ideas, or that its sort of essentiality within the idea of its identity, of the European identity, or and that relationship between society, there's a losing of that, slow eroding of that. And the cause of those erosions, in one way, is these ideals, for better or for worse, but it's fundamentally, existentially changing the church's identity. It's never had again. And we are still in the product of that. That's why we say Christendom no longer exists. We're back to an apostolic era today. Christianity cannot be assumed. We're like the early church. We're more like the early church than we are like the church in its height. And so how do we exist and how do we be? That's the conversation happening today. FYI. And so having watched the movies, this post-Vatican I, those movies are indicative. What are the conversations that the church is having, society's having? What's the context? How is it responding? What's its self-awareness? We've had conversations around this, but this is what I want you guys to consider. And then looking at that Dennis McManus lecture, its relationship and the way it's beginning to express and understand itself with relations to non-Christians, the realities of the world. It's really important, and it helps us understand the 20th century. With that being said, glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit.
As it was in the beginning,
is now, and will shall be, world without end. Amen.
Quick question, Luke. You have a note here under Catholic entrenchment that we must prevent another Father Reverend.
French Revolution.
French Revolution.
I did the same. I did the same thing when I first saw that.
Way more sense.
Despite having previously in my notes abbreviated French Revolution as FREV, and then I saw it in here. I'm like,
Well,
Father
that's
Reverend.
I just did FR.
Yeah, for real.
It also makes more sense. Oh.